Welcome to the KidMin podcast with Dr. Val and Dr. Virginia, where we talk about everything KidMin
and pull back the curtain on some of the surprises and challenges in children's ministry that nobody prepares you for.
I'm Dr. Val, and together we have over 45 years of experience in children's ministry.
I'm Dr. Virginia. Valerie and I met over 10 years ago in our doctoral program at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. We are excited to share with you all the great stuff that we have picked up over the years. We want to minister to you, the children's minister.
Welcome, friends. Thank you so much for joining us today. Dr. Virginia and I are so excited about this week because as this airs, we are at Children's Pastors Conference in Orlando, Florida, and we are just so excited about it. We are looking forward to seeing friends. We're looking forward to leading some conferences. We're just very, very excited about what the week will bring.
Yeah, amen. So if you happen to be at CPC, make sure and say hello. We would love to see you. We'd love to meet you. But yeah, we are super excited about CPC.
Yeah. You know, we love conferences. And so we're just really excited about what the week is going to bring. We are always glad to be talking with you and spending time with you. Mm-hmm. And we are also really excited about our topic for today because we love learning styles. You know, we love learning styles. We've started doing a series where every so often we're going to be doing an episode on a different learning style to help you be able to minister to your kids in a more effective way. One of the things that we have learned, and you can kind of go back and listen to the first one if you haven't heard us talking about learning styles, because at the beginning of that one, I go into a little bit more detail about where the learning styles came from and how many there are and that kind of thing. But the basic idea behind them is that we have all been given an innate way that we learn, a way of learning that just comes natural to us. And when we're children, that natural way of learning is just sort of the only thing that we really can relate to and understand and know. As we get older, we begin to learn in different ways. We begin to learn how to sit during a lecture and take notes and to learn in different styles. But when we are children, especially preschoolers, the way that we have naturally been wired to learn is just the way that we do it. And so it's just so beneficial in a classroom if we can determine a child's learning style and try to help meet them where they are so that they can learn more effectively.
Or even at the start of the year, we may not know our kids well enough, but just building in different teaching elements to a variety of learning styles, even before we know our kids well, we're going to be reaching them and hitting them in their preferred learning style and helping them learn better, even before we know what their learning style is.
Right. And we do know that people can have more than one. You can have more than one way that you enjoy learning, more than one way that you process and understand information. And so that's why it's great to have a variety of options in a classroom, not only because it just makes things more exciting because you're kind of changing things up and doing things a little differently, but also because you do tend to find ways that you can relate to kids a little bit better. And so today what we're going to do is we're going to be talking about visual learners. And the thing that I think is interesting about visual learners is that so many people, if you just typically ask somebody, how do you think that you learn well? A lot of times people will say that they're visual learners, even if they're really not visual learners, because it just happens to be one of those sort of learning styles that people automatically assume is sort of what they do, because so much of what we do is very visual. But there are people who do learn very specifically in a visual way. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. So let's sort of take a look at some of the characteristics of people who are visual learners. Visual learners tend to forget what they hear, but they remember what they see. And so it takes an element of something being seen to help them to be able to process and retain information. I am a visual learner. That's my primary way that I learn. And it's really funny because very recently there's been a lot of people talking on social media about this particular kind of phenomena where for me, I visualize things in my mind as
Mhm.
I'm talking to someone. And I
Mhm.
just always, my whole life, assumed that everyone did that.
Mhm.
Like if you say an apple, in my mind, immediately I picture an actual apple. Like I will see an actual apple in my mind. There are a lot of people who, when you say the word apple, they don't see anything in their mind. They do not
Mhm.
receive a visual for that at all. And it's very surprising if that is the way that you process and you think. But I do often visualize things in my head. It's like I have a little movie playing in my
Mhm.
head pretty much all the time. If
Mhm.
you're explaining something, like if you're telling me about going to the grocery store and buying something, I am literally playing that out as a movie in my head as you're speaking. And not everybody does that.
Mhm. And it's like that same way, like some people talk about how they have like an internal monologue. And so
Mhm.
they may not see it, they may not have like a visual apple, but they have this constant sort of like running monologue in their mind of like, oh yes, apple. I remember the apple that I ate the other day. Da, 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 you know? And
Right,
so it's very interesting how God makes us so differently and
right.
how unless you don't even think about it, just like what you're saying, you don't even think about
Mhm.
it unless you know about it or hear about it or hear someone else talking about
Yeah.
their experience and you're like, "Wait,
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
what?"
my husband and I have that argument a lot because what
Mm.
will happen is that he's a logical learner. So logic
Mhm.
is how he processes. And
Mhm.
so if he loses something, like if he loses his keys,
Mhm.
he will, be trying to find them. And my very first question is usually, well, where was the last time you remember having your keys? And he was
Yeah.
like, well, if I knew that, then I would know where my keys are.
Ah,
Because in my mind, the way I find
yeah.
something is that I picture in my mind, when was the
Yeah.
last time I had my keys with me? Like I was in the
Right,
car, I
right.
got out of the car, I walked in the house, I set them on the
Mhm.
counter. Okay, they're on the kitchen counter.
Mhm.
But he doesn't process that way. So for
Mhm.
him, when I'm saying, well, where was the last place you remember having them? It frustrates him because he can't remember where he had them last. Like that doesn't
Ah.
help him. And so it's really interesting how we have to sort of think through the way we process
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
even just to be able to communicate with one another.
Mhm.
So
Well, and it's funny. I don't think I'm not visual learning style isn't my primary learning style, but it's definitely like one of my learning styles because talking about like you forget what you hear and remember what you see. I
mhm,
remember going through school when it would be time for a test, I would basically just try to like memorize like a picture in my mind of my notes. And
mhm,
so I would come to a question on the test and be like, okay, I remember like I had that in my notes on like the top corner of the paper, try to imagine what like the top corner of the paper looked like and what was written there.
right,
And so hearing it, it's whatever, it's in one ear out
right,
the other.
right.
But trying to recall that visual image was
Mhm.
what would help me whenever I was studying and taking tests and things.
Right. Well, and that's what visual learners tend to notice everything around them visually. They love color. They
Mhm.
see shapes and symbols and signs, and so they tend to notice those types of things when
Mhm.
they are looking at their surroundings.
Mhm.
Visual learners tend to take notes and they like diagrams. I think we've talked about this before where both of us are. I'm a note taker. It helps me to
Mhm.
be able to remember if I can write it down. Back in the day when I was younger, I could make a list, and as long as I made the list, I didn't need the list to go with me
Mm,
to the store. I could visualize
right.
the list in my mind and check it
Yeah.
off mentally. As I'm getting older, I'm having a harder time doing that, but
Yep.
um, as when I was younger, especially, it was something that, just really would help me. As long as I had it written down, then it
Mhm.
was sort of already in my mind for me to be able to remember. Visual learners tend to organize their thoughts like maps or like graphics because, like I said, we
Mhm.
are very visual. So when we think about a route that we're taking, it's almost like drawing the map out in our mind, seeing the road, knowing which direction to go, or being able to see those kind of graphic, descriptions of things, just being able to see it drawn out in our mind and see the images, see the shapes, see the colors that helps us to be able to organize things and to remember things very well.
I remember the first time I had a mind map sort of introduced to me conceptually in school. I was in high school, and it was actually from our chemistry teacher who, showed us like, okay, you put like a primary concept in a bubble in the middle of the paper and you draw these sticks off of it and other ideas and other bubbles around it. And I remember at that time being like, what is this? And so we jokingly started calling it a mind mess instead of a mind map. But definitely for a visual learner,
Right.
that helps them make sense of complex concepts.
Yes,
So,
it does. Well, and that's just what I've always found. If I can draw something out, if I can lay it out and plan it out, if I can write it and do my arrows and like think, okay, step 1, this is step 2, it helps me to be able to process and to be able to learn it so much better than if somebody is just trying to tell me what to do, because I don't retain the words, because it's harder to visualize words in when somebody is talking. If I can see it, then it becomes a picture as opposed to just all of these kind of garbled things in my head. And so that's one of the reasons why I like to make lists and I like to plan, because it helps me to be able to see it, to have it laid out, to be able to kind of do the step 1, step 2, to be able to walk through it in that way. And I've already mentioned I have to visualize things to be able to remember things, and that helps me to be able to do that. I think people who are visual learners do have a very vivid imagination, because I think that we are able to create these images in our minds. And so we're able to sort of think through, because even if I'm reading like a book that's a fantasy book where it's describing, a sort of a mystical creature or something, even though it's very odd, I can picture it as long as it's described in a very visual way where I can almost draw out the image in my head to be able to see, who this person is or what this beast might be. Like I can just sort of imagine those things very easily. So that comes very naturally to me. One of the things that we want to remember in a classroom when we have visual learners and we're working with kids who respond very strongly to things that are visual is that we don't want to talk too much. Lecture is not going to be your friend with a visual learner. We want to be sure that we allow plenty of time for them to observe things. We want to make sure that they have that visual input, that they are able to see things, that they're able to look at things, that we don't want to just lecture for too very long. No preschooler can handle you lecturing too very long. We've talked about that
anyway,
a million
right.
times about
Right.
you want to really think about their listening ability, just those time spans that they can handle. And it typically is their age. And so you want to, if they're 4 years old, then you want to keep that story to less than 4 minutes. You want to really watch the idea of just talking for too long. But when you're working with visual learners, even if you're talking about just telling the story, the words are not going to stay in their minds and in their memories as well as some sort of visual that's going to go along with it. So that's when it's really great to be able to use pictures, to have those biblically accurate illustrations that we can show to the kids as we're telling the story. If we can show them maps, if we're talking about the Israelites traveling from Egypt into the Promised Land, if we can have those maps available so that they can see the route that the Israelites took, that we can show them where the countries are located so that they can get an idea of how far they're traveling, of where they're going. To be able to, to have the models, like that's a great opportunity for you to build the temple or to be use the blocks to build things with, so that they can actually see the structures that you're talking about, so that they can have those images in their minds as you tell the story. It's going to help to be able to do that.
And there's so many neat pictures too of just different pieces of archaeological evidence that have been unearthed. And so showing them a picture of, okay, this is like a, real object or place from the Bible. And, this is what archaeologists have found. And so, having those different visual teaching elements that you can pull out and use during your lesson are so, so valuable. Because just like you mentioned, attention spans, 1 minute per year of life. There's no point fighting it.
No,
so,
no.
so have that variety of activities and resources ready.
Yeah, it really, really does make a big difference. If you can allow the kids the opportunity to observe God's beauty in nature, that's huge. Anything that they're able to see and make a connection with is going to stimulate that remembering and that understanding in such a different and unique way. And so it's really important that we're able to do that. When you're thinking about activities, there are so many great activities for visual learners. So many things that we have the ability to be able to use to help sort of stimulate the visual along with the concept that we're wanting to teach. I love using board games in any way that I can. Board games just can be not only a fun way to review, but it just makes the review more active. It gives the kids a lot of manipulatives to use because you're having them spin a spinner and move a game piece. They're seeing the colors on a game board, or they're, able to move their pieces as you're going through the review. And so anytime we can do any sort of board game activity, whether or not it's something that you've built or something that you're using, a game that you've purchased that you have, is going to be huge in being able to help kids to have that visual to go along with what you're talking about. Whiteboard games are really fun to be able to do as well. Again, you're going to have more of a visual if you're drawing something out on a whiteboard, if you're writing things out on a whiteboard. So any way that you can give a visual to what the story is talking to you about, whether or not you're writing the words on the board or whether you're drawing images or you're playing a game like Pictionary or something like that, to help kids to be able to have those visuals to go along. Word puzzles are also really great for visual learners because, again, it gives them the opportunity to work with the letters and with the words. And so being able to do like a life-sized crossword puzzle, or to be able to play Wheel of Fortune, or, something like that, where they're getting a chance to try to guess the letters to be able to figure out the verse or to do, is always, just a really helpful thing. Doing crafts with the kids is always a really great, strong visual activity because you're using color, you're using materials, you're doing different things. You're making a visual of whatever the story might have to do with. So it helps the kids to be able to process and to understand better.
And so talking about, using different colors and things, and we've talked about this in our episode about Bible skills games, using different colors in your Bible skills games for memorizing different parts of the Bible.
Yeah.
And so like we talked about this, about, all the blue balls are for the New Testament, all the green balls are for the Old Testament, or, you've got your different colored popsicle sticks, and it's like, all right, all the orange ones are, the Pentateuch, all the, pink ones are the, historical books. And so, there are different ways to use color in your activities to help kids even remember and memorize scripture, develop those Bible skills. And so that use of color can sort of help kids organize all that in their brains.
Yes. Yeah. Well, anything that's going to stimulate in that way is going to be so incredibly helpful. Whenever you can do things like use blocks to build with. We've talked about using blocks before, and there's just so many different ways that if you're going to be talking about Jesus and the disciples fishing, then use the blocks to build the boats, and tell the story again once you've built the boat. Find ways to be able to use sticks and boxes to build forts and to create things. And that's going to, stimulate their imagination, but it's also going to help them to be able to visualize the story as you go along with it. Anytime you can, create tents or, any of those kinds of things with the materials, with boxes, different types of cloth and different kinds of things, that's going to really help.
Because activating kids' imaginations, yes, it is especially good for our visual learners who are so imaginative, but it can be good for so many kids, even of a variety of, learning styles, just because kids are just naturally very imaginative. And so that's a great way to just reach them where they are developmentally, especially young children, preschoolers, young children, just to teach them in a way that they naturally operate in. So rather than trying to sort of force them into our boxes of expectations of, okay, you will sit still and quiet, at a table, It's like meeting them where they are naturally, developmentally, or sometimes with their learning styles, of activating their imagination and utilizing that to reinforce our Bible lessons as we teach.
Right. And I think that means that we have to often get out of our comfort zones as a teacher to be able to try to help them to be able to process more. And I know that that's a really hard thing to do because one, we tend to teach in the way that we learn. And so we're going to just gravitate more naturally to what we're comfortable with. But also some of the things that we can do with kids sometimes can be overwhelming. Like, for example, with visual learners, a lot of visual learners are very artistic. So they enjoy drawing and sculpting and painting. And if you don't have that inclination, that can be a very intimidating activity for you to do with
You're like,
kids.
ooh, I don't want the mess.
Yeah, because it can be really messy. And I'm not saying that it's not. Doing the sculpting, being able to use clay or being able to use the Play-Doh with the kids, just having the materials out there and letting them go for it and just giving them some basic guidelines of things that they can try to do. They're going to take off with that and be able to do that. And there's a way that you can do it so that you can keep it as neat and as clean as possible. You want to cover those tables. You want to, give them all the supplies that they need. You want to make sure you have enough helpers to be able to help the kids to be able to create. But it is the same thing with painting. And I will say that one of the things that I love to do, especially with preschoolers, is to paint, is because they don't get the opportunity to do that very often.
Yes.
And so it does take some planning because you can't paint with a group of 15 4-year-olds all at one time.
Unless you have 15 adults.
Unless you have 15 adults. So you really do have to do some planning to be able to do it. And that's where I really utilize the centers a lot, but where I'm going to set up the table for maybe 2 preschoolers at a time with a teacher that's just there helping them paint. You want to make sure you have all the materials that you need. You want to make sure you're using a water-based paint that will come out very easily if they do get it on their clothes. You want to make sure you have aprons or large t-shirts or something that you can put on the kids so that you are protecting their clothes they're going to paint. And again, like I said, you only want to bring over a couple of kids at a time to do the activity so that you do have the ability to help them and to watch what they're doing and to try to keep the mess to a minimum. One of the things that I always like to do too is I like to make the paint as easy as possible. So I'm only going to pick a couple of colors for a particular activity. I am going to use paper plates because I love to paint the paint onto the paper plates and then help the kids use that to be able to paint with. So that way they don't have a bowl or a cup of paint that can get tipped over.
Spill.
Yeah, it's there on that flat. Plus, it's something very easy for me to throw away once I'm done because it's on a paper plate and it's something that I can just toss really easy. And I'm going to really give them just this very specific, we're just going to do one small item at a time. Like if we're doing flowers, then we're going to maybe try to use the paint and just make a couple of flowers. We're going to make it super simple, letting them be creative and letting them do their thing, but also trying to keep it as controlled as possible. So that you have the ability to be able to clean up very easily, but also so the kids can experience it, but then they can move on to the next thing. It's not something that's going to take up your whole entire class time, because you do want the paint to be as thin as it possibly can be so it can dry as quickly as it can. So you do want to kind of take those steps to be able to prepare. But when we can do those opportunities for kids, they love it because they so rarely get a chance to do it. And so finding those unique and creative ways that we can give them the ability to paint, I get very excited about it. I have a lot of fun doing it. It's not something that I'm going to do every Sunday. That's something that I'm just going to do maybe once a quarter. but it is something that I want to be able to try to do with my visual kids because they do enjoy it so very much.
And it's funny because my preschool age daughter asked me last night, right before bedtime, right before we're about to get ready for bed, she was like, I want to paint. And I was like, no, not right now. Painting's an outside thing. We take it outside if we're going to do it at home.
Yeah.
And so it's funny that you mentioned, that preschoolers rarely get to paint because it's true.
It's
So
true. It is something that they don't get to do very often, but it is something that, like I said, if we have it planned and in a very controlled setting,
mhm,
it's something that
mhm,
they can do and have a lot of fun with, and it
mhm.
just makes class time so much fun.
And you have to keep in mind too, again, the attention spans that, if you're doing this with 3-year-olds, they're not going to want to paint longer than 3 minutes at
Right,
most. So
right.
even if you're only doing 2 or 3 kids at a time, like you can cycle through them pretty quick because
Right.
they're not going to be sitting there the whole time,
Mhm.
painting a, Renaissance painting. Um,
Right.
that they will do their thing and be ready to move on to the next thing pretty
Mhm.
quickly.
Right.
So,
Well, and that's one of those situations too where I make sure that I have the table covered with,
mhm,
tablecloths, that I make sure that I have baby wipes ready to
mhm,
wipe off
mhm.
hands
Yeah.
and to clean up any messes. I have the paper towels sitting there and the water, I've got everything right there
Everything's
ready
ready.
to go,
Mhm,
and that's gonna make it as easy on you as it can be. So, yeah.
mhm,
Anytime we can use posters to draw
mhm,
on, any kind of spatial thinking that we can have the kids do where they can draw
mhm,
shapes and sizes and they can color things, anything like that is going to help. Any kind of media, watching videos, like if you have the opportunity with your
mhm,
material to occasionally show a video, something short, but
mhm,
again, that's going to help them to be able to
mhm,
process and to think through things better.
mhm,
Visual learners love to watch people. They love to identify people. So having those
mhm,
activities like community helpers and different kinds of things that
mhm,
you can do when you're looking at people, in missionaries in different countries and different things where you can integrate showing images of people doing the activities and things that you're talking about is going to stimulate those kids and help them to understand.
mhm. And it's interesting talking about, like different spatial things. And I think one of my favorite things to do that is universally loved anytime you teach about David and Goliath, and there's some
Mhm.
whatever debate about how tall Goliath actually was, but
Right.
however tall you think he was, get you a long sheet of butcher paper, and draw out a
Mhm.
giant on that butcher paper and, put him up on the wall, put him wherever the kids can see him.
Yeah.
Because kids love being able to see that and being able to have that reference of, okay, this is Goliath. This is how tall he was.
Mhm.
I'm going to stand here next to him so you can see how tall he was compared to like an average person.
Yeah.
Or even if you have, like a gym or a fellowship hall or an indoor area where you can lay down like painter's tape on the floor and be like, okay, like when Jesus went to the temple, like this is how big like the holy of holy was, and this is how
Right.
big this part was, and so like this is what this would have been like. And so
Mhm.
if there's ways for you to um help kids see and visualize and experience some of these things,
Mhm.
it's going to help them remember it better.
Mhm. I used to do that occasionally where I would take them to the gym for the Goliath story, and I would
Mm-hmm.
put on the wall, like, I would put an outline with tape on the wall of how tall Goliath would be, and
Mm-hmm.
then give the kids balls and let them,
Yeah,
try
let
to
them.
throw the ball to see if
Mhm,
they could hit the very top of Goliath's head, like, just, so it
mhm,
gave them that idea of the height, their
mhm,
height compared to, so it's finding those kind of visual things that you can do to help kids be able to get an idea of how large something is, how big something
mhm,
is, something that they can figure out size. It just really helps them a whole
mhm,
lot. If you can do the same like when you're talking about Noah's Ark, if you can
mhm.
go outside and pace out, how far the ark would be from one end to the other, or those kinds of things. If you have that
Right.
ability, it just gives a lot of fun things for them to be able to do.
So the thing, as we are teaching to different learning styles, just keeping in mind, as you've already mentioned, Valerie, that we tend to teach to our preferred learning style. That's sort of naturally how our teaching methods come out, is how we enjoy learning.
Mhm.
We also tend to teach how we were taught. And
Right.
so that's why you see a lot of very sort of like lecture style teaching being sort of passed down, as we see that modeled for us. And then that's in turn what we do. Um,
Mm.
but to be intentional and thoughtful as we prepare to teach, coming well prepared, just like with, doing the painting or doing the Play-Doh or the clay, coming early, coming prepared so that those activities do go smoothly.
Right.
And it's easy to have a curriculum, look at it and be like, oh my gosh, there's like 10 activities. I can't do all these. And they know you can't do all of them.
Oh yeah, no, completely.
But being intentional to do a variety of different activities as you plan across, your weeks, or your semester or your year, to build in that variety. Because there's going to be those activities that you naturally gravitate towards. And then there'll be those activities where you're like, ooh, I don't want to sing.
Right.
That's me.
Oh, yeah.
I don't want to
I don't
sing
like to
person.
sing. No, me either.
But there are kids who benefit from that and who need that. And you may think, ooh, I don't want to paint. But there are kids who are going to learn from that. And that's going to be their favorite thing and something that they remember for the rest of their lives,
Right.
painting in their Sunday school class. And so just being aware and intentional in how we plan our time with our kids and how we plan our lessons is so very valuable to help us teach kids well.
Right. Well, and I think that that's a misunderstanding that a lot of people have, especially if they're not involved in education professionally, is that they do think that there is a certain way to teach and that you have to have control of your classroom and they have to be sitting and they have to be listening and you have to be lecturing and that's what makes a good teacher. And, always there is some point where we are telling a story, where we are telling a concept, where we are speaking. But that is not necessarily the only way to learn. And again, it's like what you said, because that's the majority of the way that we've learned in our lives, we have assumed that that's the way that you teach. And especially when you're working with preschoolers, but when you're working with children of all different ages, they have not been in school long enough to learn how to learn that way. Some may naturally have those tendencies, but in general, you're not going to find children that are going to learn the most naturally by sitting and just listening and understanding through lecture. And so it is being a little bit more not just intentional with your activities, but also being creative in the way that you're going to do things so that you're doing things differently each week so that you're not doing the same. And that's why when you do look at curriculum that's been provided for you, you can get overwhelmed because the reason why we write so many activities for a specific week is not so that you can do all of them, but it's so that you can look at your classroom and determine which activities are going to be the most beneficial to help the kids be able to learn the concept that you're teaching for the week. And so we never expect you to be able to do everything in one classroom that might be provided for you in the material. But it is also sometimes where you have people that will say, oh, there's just never anything any good in my material to do. Typically because it's those things that are outside of your comfort zone. And so they're not the most enjoyable to you. And so it's really, teaching is the responsibility is on the teacher to be able to find ways to communicate the material to the student in a way that they are going to most effectively learn. And so that is how learning styles can help us when we allow ourselves to get out of our comfort zone a little bit and to be able to find the things that we think are going to engage the students.
And one of my favorite sayings is, we don't teach lessons, we teach students. And so, giving a perfect lecture is not the goal. Making sure students are taking that information in, processing it, and internalizing it. That's the goal. And so there are lots of different ways that we can accomplish that, well beyond delivering a perfect lecture. Because again, we don't teach lessons, we teach students.
Right. And they're unique and individual and they're going to learn in different ways. And that's the fun of it. That's what makes it exciting. But it does also bring some challenges. So well, we hope that discussing visual learners have helped you to be able to think of maybe some new things that you can do in your classrooms so that you can engage your students in a more effective way. That is really what our heart is with this series of looking at the different learning styles so that you can think about some of the different activities that you can do to teach the material to your kids. As always, we're just so very thankful that you've chosen to spend some time with us this week. We hope that we have been helpful and that we have met you where you are. We would love to hear from you. We would love some suggestions on topics. We would love to know what your concerns are so that we can somehow help encourage you as you work with your families. We just thank you again so much for being here, and we look forward to talking to you again soon. Bye-bye.